forest was quiet when the trucks arrived. That is what survivors from nearby villages would later describe. Not screaming, not chaos. Quiet. The kind of quiet that does not belong to a place where men are being led into the trees. One by one, hands bound behind their backs with a rope. A single shot to the base of the skull. The body dropped into a pit. The next man brought forward. This happened every night for weeks, and then it stopped. The pits were covered. The trees grew back. The snow came. For 3 years, nobody said anything officially. Not the government that ordered it, not the allies who suspected it, not the international bodies designed to prevent exactly this kind of thing. The silence was not accidental. It was enforced, managed, and protected at the highest levels of 2 global superpowers, one of which called itself a democracy. What happened in the Katyn forest in the spring of 1940 was not a battle. It was not a war crime committed in the heat of combat. It was a bureaucratic decision, signed in ink, stamped with authority, and carried out with industrial precision. 22,000 men, executed, then erased, and the world was told someone else did it. To understand what happened at Katyn, you have to understand what Poland represented to Joseph Stalin, not as a nation, not as a people, but as a problem. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 16 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. This was not a coincidence. It was the result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a secret agreement signed just weeks earlier that carved Eastern Europe between Hitler and Stalin like a butcher dividing a carcass. Poland ceased to exist as a sovereign state within the month. When Soviet forces swept into eastern Poland, they encountered something they had not fully anticipated, a military and intellectual class that did not surrender its identity along with its territory. The Poles they captured were not just soldiers, they were the architecture of a civilization. Officers trained in law, medicine, engineering, and philosophy, police commanders who had run institutions, university professors who had shaped a generation, reserve officers who in peacetime had been judges, doctors, lawyers, and priests. The Soviets moved quickly to separate them from the enlisted men. By October 1939, approximately 22,000 Polish prisoners of war, officers, border guards, policemen, landowners, factory owners, lawyers, officials, had been processed and transferred to 3 main holding camps, Kozielsk, Starobielsk, and Ostashkov. The conditions were not pleasant, but they were survivable. The men wrote letters home. Some received them back. What the prisoners did not know, what they could not have imagined, was that they were already being evaluated. Not for release, not for prisoner exchange, for something else entirely. Lavrenti Beria was the head of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. He was a meticulous man in the way that executioners must be meticulous, precise, organized, entirely without remorse. On March 5, 1940, Beria sat down and wrote a memorandum to Joseph Stalin. The document was formal and clinical. It identified the Polish prisoners as hardened, uncompromising enemies of Soviet authority. It noted they were from bourgeois and landowning backgrounds. It described them as a threat to Soviet security in the newly acquired territories. And then it made a recommendation. Beria proposed that all of them should be shot. The memo was read, considered, and approved. Stalin signed it. So did Voroshilov, Molotov, and Mikoyan. 3 others, Kalinin and Kaganovich, would later be identified as supporters of the decision. This was not an impulsive act of wartime violence. It was a committee decision, a policy, a resolution passed by the highest levels of the Soviet state, authorizing the murder of more than 20,000 men, most of whom had never fired a shot at a Soviet soldier. The order went out in March. The killing began in April. The operation was assigned to NKVD units under the direct supervision of regional commanders. It was systematic in a way that reveals how thoroughly it had been planned. At Kozielsk, which held primarily Polish army officers, the men were told they were being transferred. This was standard NKVD procedure, the lie of transit used to prevent panic and resistance. Small groups were loaded onto trains, processed through a staging point at Gnezdovo station near Smolensk, and then driven by truck to a wooded area designated in internal documents as a rest facility. The designation was a bureaucratic fiction. The area was the Katyn forest. At Kalinin, the men from Ostashkov were taken to the NKVD building in the city. The building had a special room, soundproofed, a drain in the floor. They were brought in one at a time. A rope was looped over their wrists, pulled tight behind them, and then tied to the rope already around their necks, so that any attempt to pull their hands free would tighten the noose. The executioner used a German-made pistol, a Walser 7.65, one shot. The body was removed, the floor was cleaned. The next man was brought in. At Kharkiv, the process was the same. The NKVD kept records of everything. They were an organization that believed in documentation. Names, dates, prisoner numbers, all of it carefully logged. Transportation manifests, execution orders, burial coordinates, all of it filed and stamped and preserved in archives that, for 50 years, would officially not exist. The killing took approximately 6 weeks. By May 1940, it was finished. At Katyn alone, more than 4,000 bodies were stacked in mass graves. The men had been shot in the back of the skull, often with hands tied, often still in their uniforms. Many still had their personal documents, letters from family, religious medals. Personal items that a regime more practiced in concealment would have removed. Items that would later become the central evidence of what had actually happened. The forests were quiet again. The NKVD reported the operation complete. Beria confirmed it to Stalin. The paperwork was filed. 22,000 men had been alive, now they were not. And the Soviet Union turned its attention elsewhere. For 2 years, nothing official was said. Families in occupied Poland waited for letters that stopped coming. Polish officials who tried to inquire were met with Soviet bureaucratic silence, misdirection, vague references to transfers, and deliberate confusion about which camp held which prisoners. The men had simply become unavailable. Then Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, and everything changed. Suddenly Stalin needed allies. The British had been at war with Hitler since 1939. In 1941, Germany turned east, and the strategic calculus shifted completely. The enemy of the Soviet Union was now the enemy of the Western powers. An alliance was necessary, and as part of that alliance, Stalin agreed to release Polish prisoners of war so they could form a fighting force, to be organized and led by a Polish general named Władysław Anders. Anders was a military man of precise habits and careful questions. He began making inquiries about the officers. He knew they had been captured. He knew they had been held in the camps. He submitted lists. He requested names. He asked Soviet officials, formally and repeatedly, where his officers were. The Soviets told him they had been released, that they had travelled east, perhaps to Manchuria, that they might have escaped to some third country. The answers shifted with each inquiry. There was never a consistent account, because there was no truthful account to give. The men were not in Manchuria. They were not in a third country. They were in the ground. Anders continued building his army. He evacuated it through Iran in 1942. He trained it. He would eventually lead it to fight at Monte Cassino, one of the most brutal battles of the Italian campaign. But the core of his original officer corps, the experienced commanders, the trained professionals who should have formed the backbone of his force, they were never found. He never stopped asking. Nobody ever gave him an honest answer. In February 1943, German Army Group Center was conducting operations in the area around Smolensk. German soldiers and local workers began to notice a certain depression in the Katyn forest. The ground had been disturbed. There were anomalies, the kind of visual irregularities that, in wartime, suggest mass burials. German authorities ordered an excavation on April 13th, 1943. What came out of the ground over the next several weeks was categorical. More than 4,000 bodies, Polish officers in uniform, hands bound, bullet wounds to the base of the skull, a specific, deliberate method. Documents found on the bodies dated from 1939 and early 1940. Letters, diaries, personal photographs. Some of the bodies carried newspaper clippings from April 1940, nothing later than spring 1940. The forensic evidence was immediate and consistent. These men had died in 1940, not 1941. Germany announced the discovery publicly on April 13th, 1943, presenting it as evidence of Soviet atrocity. Berlin was not wrong about what had happened. They were, however, entirely cynical about the announcement. Germany had its own mass graves across occupied Europe, and the Katyn announcement was designed to drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and the Polish government-in-exile. It worked, though not in the way Germany intended. The Polish government-in-exile, based in London, immediately requested an investigation by the International Red Cross. This was a reasonable, formal, procedurally correct request. It was also politically catastrophic. Stalin responded with fury. He announced that the Polish government-in-exile was collaborating with fascist propaganda. He accused Poland of aligning with Nazi Germany, and he used the Red Cross request as a pretext to formally sever relations with the Polish government-in-exile on April 25, 1943, a move that would have enormous consequences for what happened to Poland after the war. The request was entirely legitimate. The severing of relations was a political assassination. What happened next is the part of this story that does not appear prominently in most Western accounts, because what happened next involved not just the Soviet Union, but the United States and Britain. The Western Allies knew, not suspected, knew, or knew enough that the distinction barely matters. In 1943, American and British officials received intelligence assessments concluding that the Soviet Union was most likely responsible for the Katyn massacre. The forensic evidence, the dates on the documents, the state of the bodies, the German pistols that nonetheless matched Soviet execution methodology, pointed clearly toward 1940. The conclusion was not difficult to reach if you were willing to reach it. They were not willing. Franklin Roosevelt assigned a Polish-American diplomat named George Howard Earl to investigate Katyn. Earl gathered evidence. He interviewed witnesses. He reached the conclusion that the Soviets had done it. He prepared a report. Roosevelt ordered him not to publish it and transferred him to a posting in Samoa, effectively removing him from the conversation. Winston Churchill's government suppressed a report by British-Polish liaison officers who had conducted their own assessment and reached similar conclusions. The report was buried. Officially, the question was left open. The reasoning was not difficult to understand, even if it was impossible to defend morally. In 1943, the Soviet Union was carrying the main weight of the land war against Germany. The Eastern Front was consuming millions of lives. The alliance with Stalin was considered militarily essential. A formal accusation that the Soviet Union had massacred 22,000 Polish officers would destabilize the alliance at a moment when the alliance was necessary for the defeat of Hitler. That was the calculation. The murdered men of Katyn were weighed against the strategic necessity of Soviet military cooperation, and they lost. At the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946, the Soviet Union attempted to include the Katyn massacre in the official indictment against German war criminals. The Soviet prosecutors argued that the murders had been committed by German forces in 1941. The British and American prosecutors, who had access to evidence contradicting this claim, quietly declined to support the charge. The Nuremberg tribunal did not include Katyn in its final judgment, which was, functionally, an acknowledgement that the evidence did not support the German attribution, even if no one said so directly. The Soviet Union understood what that silence meant, and they continued the official version anyway. For 40 years, the lie held. Inside the Soviet Union, it was not a lie, it was a law. Soviet historians wrote about the German atrocity at Katyn. Soviet encyclopedias documented it. Soviet school curricula incorporated it. To question the official version was not merely taboo, it was criminal. Poles who raised the subject publicly faced arrest, imprisonment, or professional destruction. Soviet citizens who handled the actual documents, and some did because the archives existed, they were simply sealed, worked under instructions that guaranteed silence. The Polish government, installed by Stalin after the war, the People's Republic of Poland, cooperated with the official narrative as a condition of its existence. Polish historians who wanted to survive professionally did not write about Katyn, or they wrote what Moscow required. Outside the Soviet sphere, the evidence persisted in fragments. The Polish government-in-exile in London maintained records. Polish émigré communities preserved documents and testimony. Western scholars, who examined the available evidence, reached the correct conclusion. But the official position of Western governments remained carefully non-committal, partly out of residual Cold War diplomatic caution, partly out of what might be called institutional embarrassment about the extent to which the evidence had been suppressed in 1943. The families of the men executed at Katyn lived inside this silence for 4 decades. They knew their fathers and husbands and brothers had been killed. They could not say who had done it without consequences. They attended official commemorations of the German massacre. They laid flowers at the designated memorial site. They understood the imposed fiction and could not refuse it publicly without risking everything. The memorial that stood in Poland during the communist period gave 1941 as the year of the massacre. The wrong year, the wrong perpetrator, inscribed in stone. The official admission came in 1990, 50 years after the killing. Mikhail Gorbachev, as part of the broader opening initiated under Glasnost, acknowledged that the Soviet NKVD had been responsible for the Katyn massacre. The Russian government subsequently released portions of the original documentation, including the March 5, 1940 memorandum, signed by Beria and countersigned by Stalin, Voroshilov, Molotov, and the other members of the Politburo who had approved the death order. The document was exactly what it appeared to be, a signed authorization for the systematic murder of an entire professional class of a conquered nation. Nothing coded, nothing euphemistic. A proposal to shoot them, approved, stamped, and filed. Boris Yeltsin, Gorbachev's successor, released further documents and issued statements of acknowledgement. The Russian government officially attributed responsibility to the Soviet leadership. A memorial was established at the actual Katyn site. Polish political leaders visited. Russian political leaders joined them. But the legal and political reckoning that many Poles sought, a formal acknowledgement of the act as genocide, criminal proceedings against whatever surviving participants could be identified, full disclosure of the complete archival record, did not fully materialize. Russia opened the archives selectively. A Russian prosecution, launched in the 1990s, was eventually closed without public findings. Key documents remained classified. The full scope of who was responsible, who carried out the executions, who covered them up, and what the complete chain of command looked like was never comprehensively made public. In April 2010, a Polish Air Force plane carrying President Lech Kaczynski and 95 other senior Polish officials to a commemoration at Katyn crashed near Smolensk. All 96 people on board were killed. They were travelling to mark the 70th anniversary of the massacre. The location of the crash, the approach to the airfield used to bring the Polish prisoners to Katyn in 1940, was not lost on anyone. The cause of the crash was officially determined to be pilot error in poor visibility conditions. Many Poles disputed this finding and continue to dispute it. The debate became politically charged in ways that sometimes obscured and sometimes illuminated the unresolved history underneath. But what the crash did, with brutal clarity, was demonstrate that Katyn had not finished producing consequences. 70 years later, it was still killing. Here is what the record shows. 22,000 men were killed by an institutional decision made at the highest level of the Soviet state. The decision was not made in the confusion of combat or under the pressure of military emergency. It was made deliberately, in peacetime conditions, by men sitting at desks. Beria wrote the memo. Stalin signed it. The others countersigned. The NKVD carried it out with professional efficiency. The men who were killed had committed no crime under any legal standard that the Soviet Union had formally adopted. They were prisoners of war. Killing prisoners of war is a war crime under the conventions that the Soviet Union, like other major powers, had nominally accepted. The targeting of an entire professional and intellectual class for elimination because of their social background and perceived political unreliability is a definition consistent with genocide as later codified in international law. None of the men who signed the March 5, 1940 order faced legal consequences for it. Most died of other causes, of old age, or in Stalin's own subsequent purges. Beria was executed in 1953, but for political crimes against the post-Stalin Soviet leadership, not for Katyn. The NKVD officers who carried out the shootings lived out their lives without prosecution. The Western governments that suppressed evidence and declined to support truthful investigation in 1943 never issued formal apologies for those decisions. The men who made the choices, Roosevelt, Churchill, their intelligence chiefs, and diplomatic advisors, are remembered primarily for winning the war, which they did. The cost of certain decisions made in the process of winning that war was borne by others. The Polish officers who were killed in 1940 never received the formal military honours accorded to soldiers killed in combat. Their families waited decades for acknowledgement. Some of those families did not survive to receive it. The children of the men executed at Katyn are elderly now. Some have died. The grandchildren attend the commemorations. And the complete archive, the full documentation of who did what, who knew, who was told to stay silent, and what exactly was filed and where, has never been fully released. That is not an accident. In the Katyn forest, the trees are tall now. The light comes through them in the way that light comes through very old trees, filtered, quiet, almost gentle. There are memorials, there are visitors, there are ceremonies with flags and speeches and formal acknowledgements of terrible history. But somewhere in Moscow, in a building with controlled access and classification designations that have not changed, there are documents that have not been read by anyone outside that building in decades. The men who signed the order are all dead. The men who carried it out are all dead. The men who buried the evidence in 1943 are all dead. The documents are not.